a developer in any environment requires you to understand the tools we have for building any given application. What do you do when you get stuck? Where can you look for possible APIs that you could use? Here's a few tips. If you get stuck in this course, or even in your own projects, you can ask for help in the Treehouse forum. Your fellow students can give you hints and suggestions. In fact, students are rewarded for participating in the forum and giving best answers. Be sure to remember to embed your code or link to the source code of your project. Got an error and not having much luck in the forum? The chances are someone else has had the same issue as you. How do you find them? Open up your favourite search engine and paste in what seems the most important part of the error message. There's countless numbers of blogs, sites, forums, newsgroups where people post their problems to and how they solved it. But the most important place you can go to see what's possible with any given thing is going to its official documentation site. In our case, it will be the Node.js documentation site. So let's take a quick look now. So let's jump into the Node.js's official website, nodejs.org, and click on the docs in the navigation. In other languages or frameworks, it may say documentation or API. Generally, these terms are interchangeable. The documentation is to document the API or the interface with the objects in the language, environment, or framework you're going to be working in. Now, don't worry if this looks different to how it looks on your screen. Websites are always being updated. As a developer, we must be ever adaptive to our ever-changing surroundings. Let's click on API docs, and there's a table of contents here. Let's click on About these docs, and I just want to point out this section at the bottom here, the Stability Index. Being on the cutting edge of web development means that things can change, and each section of this documentation site has been given a stability index. So 0 means you shouldn't be using this anymore because it's deprecated. 1 is experimental, so it may become something in the future or it may be removed. So you've been warned. 2 is unstable, meaning it's moving towards stability. Things could still change here, but needs more real-world testing. Whilst indexes 3 to 5, stable, API frozen and locked, shouldn't change unless something serious happens. You're safe to use these in your applications. As a developer, you'll be making difficult decisions all the time, and choosing what APIs you should use over another is one of those times. But a general rule of thumb is to stick to the stable, frozen and locked APIs. Now, let's go back to the API docs and take a look at some things that you can do with Node.js. Listed here are all the APIs that come out of the box with Node.js, and all should have their own stability index. Some of the most common APIs we're going to use are console, which is a way that we can output strings to the console, file system, where we can see the APIs to read and write files, and HTTP and HTTPS, for creating web servers or going out to the internet to retrieve information. Let's take a look at one example, HTTP. When we click through, we see a table of contents where we can skim through all the possible objects, methods, and properties relating to the HTTP web requests and responses. Let's take a look at HTTP request. When I read documentation, I tend to look toward the code examples. Often following the flow of the code helps us with the understanding of how something works. Others may tend to look at the text for full descriptions before reading the code. If you feel that you need more time to digest the documentation, feel free to pause and review at any time. Also, if you feel overwhelmed or that you're aimlessly clicking through links trying to find what you need, don't worry, we all feel that way. Documentation sites aren't perfect or sometimes aren't even that friendly for developers in general, let alone new developers. Let's step through the example below at a high level. This first part is a set of options. It looks like we're defining a URL to upload something to google.com. This part looks like we're creating a request, REQ or REC. I wish documentation sites didn't abbreviate words like this because if you're new, it's easy to mistake res over here and rec. The
Res here is the response, and this rec is the request. So we pass in the options, which is the URL, and this function here is a callback, or an anonymous function. This is like our client sending the payment to us. In this case, it's Google's server sending back a response. Because Node.js is built with a non-blocking model in mind, this is a common pattern you'll see when building Node.js applications. A lot of APIs require callback functions. Callback functions get executed when Node.js has finished performing a particular task or a particular event occurs. If you've built Ajax applications before, you don't want your JavaScript program to halt while you wait for the response from the server. You give it a callback to run once when the data has been downloaded. If you've ever interacted with user events like a mouse click or a key press, you don't want to halt your application from running until that event occurs. You give a callback to that to be executed when that event occurs. In Node.js, you do the same thing. You provide callbacks for system events. So in this example down here, the response has an event called data associated with it. And this callback prints out the chunk or a piece of data. This bit of code here responds to an error event on the request. When you see an on being called on an object, that means that this method is responding to an event. You'll see this a lot in Node.js. And since this request is a post, we can write some data for the server to process. This doesn't really help you understand what this would be good for. This is a pretty arbitrary example. But here's one for you. If you needed to interface with a website with no API, but they had web forms that you could input data, you could build a script in JavaScript like this, and you could submit the information to the forms programmatically. You could even upload files like this too, say if you were building a photo sharing website like Flickr. And then finally at the end here, we close the request. This tells the server that all the information or the data you want to send has been sent. This is when we wait for the response from the server. Note that the code for dealing with the response happens before you call the request's end method. This is a common pattern when your code that you provide only gets executed when it needs to. This is a callback. So an important thing to note about all of this is, if I wrote some code at the end here, it would get executed immediately after the end, because we're still waiting back for this request. So the way that the code is executed in a non-blocking way. So because we've done request end, the script isn't going to block. It's going to execute a line. So if I did console hello world, it would print out hello world before it started printing this body here. That's because Node is non-blocking.
As a developer, being able to ask specific questions, showing examples of your code, and synthesizing information from a number of sources is an absolute required skill. It may feel daunting at first, but it gets better, I promise. It takes practice, but for now, I'll be here to help you build this command line application together.